Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the quiet corridors of history. Tonight, we venture into a time when the world seemed to hold its breath, when entire communities found themselves trapped between survival and surrender. A world where isolation meant something far more profound than our modern understanding of the word. And faith walked hand in hand down empty streets, and when ordinary people made extraordinary sacrifices. You'll discover the rhythm of daily life when death itself seemed to have taken residence in your neighborhood, and how communities both crumbled and somehow, remarkably, endured. Where the simple act of opening your door could mean the difference between life and death, and where communities faced choices that would echo through the centuries. You might imagine yourself settling into the familiar comfort of your bed, perhaps with the distant hum of modern life beyond your windows, the occasional car passing, the gentle buzz of electricity, the reassuring knowledge that help is always just a phone call away. But tonight, we travel back to a different world entirely. We'll explore what it truly meant to live in a plague village during the great pestilences that swept across Europe when fear. So settle in and let us begin this gentle exploration of a time when the world was much smaller, much more fragile, and yet somehow, in its quiet desperation, revealed the most profound aspects of human nature. Why it sucked to be quarantined in 1349. Imagine yourself waking in the pre-dawn darkness of a 14th century English village. The year is 1349, and outside your small cottage, the world has changed in ways that would have seemed impossible just months before. The priest, Father William, was among the first to succumb 3 weeks ago, his final blessing whispered to an empty sanctuary. No roosters crow from neighboring yards. Most of the chickens have already been slaughtered and eaten, their owners too weak or too dead to maintain proper care. The familiar sounds of wooden wheels on cobblestones of merchants calling their wares, of children's laughter echoing from the village green, all of these have been swallowed by a silence so complete it seems to press against your very soul. Each morning, you must venture out to check on your neighbors, not out of mere courtesy. The earthiness of freshly turned soil from graves that seem to multiply like mushrooms after rain, and underneath it all, the faint but persistent odor of decay that no amount of prayer or burning sage can entirely mask. But because in a village where everyone's survival depends on everyone else's effort, the living must constantly inventory the dead. And you? Her shutters remain closed, just as they were yesterday and the day before. Through the small gaps in the wooden slats, you can see the flicker of candlelight within, and you know she still lives, though whether she is well or merely surviving one more day in the gray space between health and sickness, you cannot say. The miller's cottage has been silent for 3 days now, and you make a mental note to organize a burial detail before the day grows too warm. In plague time, the dead cannot be left to rest in peace within their homes. They must be removed quickly, before they add their own contribution to the disease that stalks your streets. You don't knock. The protocol has been established through bitter experience. Those who are well announce themselves with a call from the garden gate. In a plague village, well enough simply means not dead yet. Those who are unwell remain silent, and their silence is respected. You make your way along the narrow path between cottages, stepping carefully around the small garden plots that have already begun to show the neglect of their absent tenders. You lie still on your straw mattress, listening to the silence that has become the most terrifying sound of all, the absence of the usual morning sounds that once marked the rhythm of village life. No church bells ring to call the faithful to morning prayer. You rise slowly, your joints protesting from the damp that seems to seep through every crack in your humble dwelling. You have no stockpiled supplies, no government assistance, no medical care, waiting just a phone call away. The world beyond your village might as well exist on another planet. The roads that once brought merchants and travelers now serve as barriers more impenetrable than any prison wall. The fire in your hearth has died to barely glowing embers, and the chill of early morning cuts through your thin woolen clothing. No one enters, no one leaves. The decision was made in desperation when it became clear that the great mortality had found its way into your small corner of the world. You remember the meeting in the church, how the handful of survivors had stood in that vast, echoing space that once held the entire community, their voices seeming small and lost among the empty pews. Outside, the fog clings to the ground like a shroud, and somewhere in that mist, the sickness waits. The quarantine was declared by the village elders, those few who remained nearly a month ago. But quarantine in 1349 is not the isolation of our modern world, with its delivery services and digital connections. Your daily routine has become a careful dance with death itself. The morning air carries scents that have become all too familiar. The sweet, cloying smell of herbs burned in a futile attempt to ward off the pestilence. You pause at the cottage of Margaret, the baker's widow. "Margaret," you call softly, your voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Are you keeping well this morning?" The pause stretches long enough that you feel your heart quicken, but then her voice drifts back, thin but steady. "Well enough? Praise be to God." "Well enough," you respond, though the phrase has lost most of its meaning. You continue your circuit, noting which cottages show signs of life and which have fallen into the terrible stillness that means another family has been claimed by the sickness. The church graveyard has long since overflowed. The new graves are dug in what was once the village green, that patch of common ground where children played and festivals were held. Now it serves as a reminder of how quickly the familiar can become the unthinkable. Your food supplies, never abundant in the best of times, have dwindled to whatever could be foraged, hunted, or coaxed from neglected gardens. The stored grain that should have lasted until harvest has been carefully rationed, but mathematics is a cruel master when applied to empty stomachs and uncertain futures. You remember helping to dig the first graves there, how strange it felt to break the ground that had been worn smooth by generations of dancing feet and playing children. But it's the practical realities of quarantine that truly test the human spirit. There's Thomas the carpenter, his beard now streaked with premature gray, who has been showing signs of the fever, whether the remaining chickens should be slaughtered now or saved for another week. How to repair the thatch on the blacksmith's cottage now that he has gone, and his skills with him. And beside him stands young Alice, who has become the village's unofficial leader despite her barely 16 years. The day stretches ahead with its familiar burdens, tending your small garden, preparing whatever food you can manage, maintaining the tools and equipment that keep your household functioning, and always, listening for the sounds that might indicate another neighbor has fallen to the pestilence. There are no specialists anymore, no division of labor that allows each person to focus on their particular skill. Everyone must be farmer, nurse, gravedigger, and priest all at once. Outside, the village sleeps its uneasy sleep, and somewhere in the darkness, the great mortality keeps its patient vigil. Tomorrow will bring the same routine, the same careful balance between hope and despair, the same grinding work of survival. The work is meditative, almost peaceful, and for brief moments, you can almost forget the circumstances that have made this simple labor so crucial to your survival. When the roads will again carry merchants and travelers, when the children will play once more on the village green. But for now, all you can do is survive another day, and pray that the simple act of survival itself might prove to be enough. You don't know if the measures you've taken will prove sufficient, if the sickness that seems to strike at random will pass your door by, or if tomorrow will bring the fever and chills that mark the beginning of the end. The constant awareness that you are living on an island of desperate hope, surrounded by an ocean of uncertainty. These realities intrude with the persistence of physical pain. You don't know if other villages have found better ways to survive, or if the entire world beyond your borders has simply succumbed to the great mortality. The old hierarchy has crumbled along with everything else. Age and wisdom mean little when they offer no protection against the pestilence. The well at the village center has become a meeting place of sorts, though the meetings are conducted with careful distance and nervous glances. Here, the survivors gather to share information, to coordinate the endless tasks of survival. She doesn't finish the sentence. Everyone knows that smoke on the horizon might mean that another village has decided to burn itself clean rather than face the slow agony of siege by sickness, and to maintain the thin threads of community that keep the village from dissolving entirely into individual desperation. You approach the well with your wooden bucket, noting the small cluster of villagers who have already gathered. Any word from the outside? You ask, though you know the answer. There has been no word from the outside for weeks. The last traveler to reach the village had brought news of the great mortality sweeping through the larger towns, and he had died within days of his arrival, perhaps bringing the very sickness he warned against. Alice shakes her head. Nothing. But we saw smoke from the direction of Little Wickham yesterday. Could be they're burning the dead? Or the conversation turns to immediate concerns. Who will check on the widow, Sarah? These are the unglamorous details of survival in a plague village, the constant, grinding work of maintaining life when all the normal support systems have collapsed. You return to your cottage with water that tastes faintly of the herbs that have been scattered around the well's rim. Another futile gesture against the invisible enemy that has made prisoners of you all. But perhaps the most exhausting aspect of quarantine life is the constant weight of uncertainty. The afternoon brings its own rhythms. You tend your small garden, pulling weeds and checking for signs of the vegetables that might stretch your food supplies another few days. But the peace is always temporary. A cough echoing from a nearby cottage, the sight of another door, marked with a simple cross that indicates a household touched by sickness. As evening approaches, you light your single candle and settle in for another night of quarantine. You close your eyes and try to imagine a time when the morning will bring church bells instead of silence. As we move deeper into our exploration of life in plague-stricken communities, let us turn our attention to a story that has echoed through the centuries, a tale of collective sacrifice that transforms individual suffering into something approaching nobility. You might find yourself wondering how ordinary people, faced with circumstances beyond their control, discover within themselves the capacity for extraordinary moral courage. In the year 1665, nearly 3 centuries after the great mortality we just explored, the small village of Eyam in Derbyshire found itself confronting the same ancient enemy. But this time, the story would unfold differently, shaped by a decision that would make this quiet community a symbol of selfless heroism for generations to come. Picture, if you will, a village nestled in the gentle hills of the Peak District, where limestone cottages huddle together along winding lanes, their stone walls warm in the summer sun and solid against the winter winds. Eyam was neither wealthy, nor particularly notable a place of farmers and artisans, lead miners and shopkeepers, where life moved at the steady pace of seasonal change and religious observance. The plague arrived, as it so often did, hidden within the folds of ordinary commerce. A box of cloth patterns sent from London to Alexander Hadfield, the village tailor, carried within its innocent-looking fabric the seeds of catastrophe. Cloth was damp when it arrived, and as George Vickers, the tailor's assistant, spread it before the fire to dry, he unknowingly released into the air the fleas that would soon transform his quiet world into a battlefield between life and death. Within days, George himself was dead, his body covered with the dark swellings that marked the bubonic plague's cruel signature. The disease moved through the village with the relentless efficiency of a flooding river, seeping into cottage after cottage, family after family. But it was what happened next that would distinguish Eyam from countless other plague-stricken communities throughout history. The decision came not from the village elders or the local magistrate, but from the pulpit of the parish church. William Mompesson, the young rector who had arrived in Eyam just 2 years earlier, stood before his diminishing congregation and proposed something that must have seemed like madness to those who heard it. He suggested that the village should voluntarily isolate itself, cutting off all contact with the outside world to prevent the spread of the disease to neighboring communities. Imagine the weight of that moment, the silence that must have filled the church as the villagers contemplated what was being asked of them. They were being invited to trap themselves within their own boundaries, to become willing prisoners of their own moral conscience, knowing that doing so would likely condemn many of them to death. Yet remarkably, incredibly, the villagers of Eyam agreed. They would create their own quarantine, not imposed by outside authorities, but chosen freely as an act of collective sacrifice. They would become martyrs, not for faith alone, but for the principle that their neighbors' lives were worth more than their own chances of survival. The practical arrangements of this self-imposed isolation were worked out with the methodical care of people who understood they were designing their own siege. A boundary was established around the village, marked by stone posts that still stand today as monuments to their sacrifice. No one would cross this boundary in either direction. The villagers would not flee, and outsiders would not enter. But how does a community survive when it has voluntarily cut itself off from all external support? The answer lay in the compassion of their neighbors and the ingenuity born of desperation. The Earl of Devonshire, who held lands near Eyam, arranged for supplies to be left at designated points along the boundary. Food, medicine, and other necessities would be deposited at these locations, and the villagers would collect them after the delivery parties had withdrawn to a safe distance. Payment was left in hollow stones filled with vinegar, which was believed to cleanse the coins of pestilence. These simple arrangements, the careful choreography of survival conducted across an invisible but absolute barrier, became the rhythm of daily life in plague-bound Eyam. You might envision the strange processions that marked this new routine. Villagers making their way to the boundary stones in the early morning mist, moving like ghosts through their own landscape, collecting the supplies that represented the outside world's recognition of their sacrifice. The loneliness of these journeys, the weight of knowing that each step took them further from the normal world and deeper into their chosen isolation, must have been almost unbearable. Within the village itself, life took on the heightened intensity that comes with the knowledge that time is running short. Families drew closer together, knowing that they might be spending their last days in each other's company. The church services, led by Rector Mompesson, became more frequent and more fervent as the villagers sought comfort in faith and ritual. But it was not only the rector who provided spiritual guidance during these dark months. Thomas Stanley, the previous rector who had remained in the village after his replacement, worked alongside Mompesson to minister to the dying and comfort the bereaved. The sight of these two men, representing different traditions within the church, but united in their commitment to their flock, became a symbol of the village's determination to maintain its humanity in the face of catastrophe. The plague showed no mercy to age or virtue. Children died in their parents' arms, and parents were buried by their surviving children. The village graveyards filled quickly, and new burial grounds had to be consecrated in fields that had once grown crops. Some families were wiped out entirely, their cottages standing empty as monuments to lives cut short. Elizabeth Hancock endured perhaps the cruelest burden of all. In the space of just 8 days, she buried her husband and 6 children, digging their graves herself in a field that would later be known as the Riley Graves. The image of this woman, alone in the gathering dusk, committing her family to the earth with her own hands, captures something essential about the human capacity to endure even when endurance seems impossible. Yet even in the depths of their suffering, the villagers of Eyam maintained their commitment to their neighbors beyond the boundary stones. They could have broken their self-imposed quarantine at any time. There was no physical barrier preventing. Escape. No guards to stop them from fleeing. The boundary existed only in their collective will, maintained by nothing more than their word and their conscience. As the months passed, the death toll mounted with relentless persistence. By some accounts, nearly half the village perished during those terrible months of 1665 and 1666. The population, which had numbered around 350 before the plague arrived, was reduced to perhaps 200 survivors when the pestilence finally burned itself out. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The neighboring communities remained largely untouched by the plague, spared by the willingness of the Eyam villagers to contain the disease within their own boundaries. The ripple effects of their decision, the thousands of lives that were saved because they chose to stay, can never be fully calculated, but they represent a profound testament to the power of moral courage in the face of overwhelming circumstance. The story of Eyam reminds us that even in the darkest moments of human history, ordinary people can choose to act with extraordinary nobility. The villagers were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were farmers and artisans, mothers and fathers, young and old, people whose names would never have been recorded in the great chronicles of their time. But they possessed something that no amount of wealth or power could purchase: the ability to see beyond their own immediate needs to the greater good of their community. When the plague finally ended, the survivors emerged from their self-imposed isolation to find a world that had continued to turn without them. They had missed harvests and seasons, births and marriages in neighboring villages, the small events that make up the fabric of normal life. But they had also participated in something that transcended normal life, a collective act of sacrifice that would be remembered long after the details of their individual struggles had faded into history. The village of Eyam stands today as a testament to their choice, its streets and cottages preserved as a memorial to the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary moral decisions. Visitors come from around the world to walk the same paths that the plagued villagers walked, to see the boundary stones that marked their voluntary prison, and to contemplate the question that lies at the heart of their story. What would we choose to do if faced with the same impossible decision? As we prepare to continue our journey through the landscape of plague history, let us carry with us the memory of those villagers who chose to stay, who transformed their suffering into service, and who proved that even in the face of certain death, the human spirit can find ways to affirm life itself. As we delve deeper into the strange and haunting chapters of history's relationship with disease and desperation, we encounter phenomena that challenge our understanding of the human mind and body. Sometimes, the most profound mysteries emerge, not from the grand sweep of political events or the march of armies, but from the inexplicable behavior of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. You might find yourself wondering how far the human psyche can be pushed before it breaks free from the constraints of rational behavior. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, such a breaking point was reached in a manner so bizarre, so utterly unprecedented, that it continues to puzzle historians and medical experts to this day. Picture the cobblestone streets of Strasbourg in the early morning hours of July 14, 1518. The city was prosperous, its half-timber-bird houses rising in neat rows along the Rhine, its markets bustling with the commerce that had made it one of the great trading centers of Europe. But prosperity could not shield its inhabitants from the grinding anxieties of their age, the constant threat of disease, the uncertainty of harvest, the ever-present specter of divine judgment that haunted the medieval mind. It was on this ordinary summer morning that a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the street outside her home and began to dance. Not the measured, ceremonial dancing of festival or celebration, but a wild, compulsive movement that seemed to possess her entire being. Her feet moved in rapid, repetitive steps, her arms swaying and turning as if controlled by some invisible force. Hour after hour, she continued her strange performance, unable or unwilling to stop even as curious neighbors gathered to watch God. At first, the sight might have seemed merely eccentric, a woman, overcome perhaps by religious fervor or temporary madness. But as the day wore on, and Frau Trophia continued her relentless motion, the crowd's amusement turned to concern, and concern to alarm. She danced through the morning, through the afternoon, through the evening, and into the night, her movements becoming more frenzied rather than less. Her feet bleeding from the constant friction against the rough stone streets. By the second day, she had been joined by others. A handful of women and men, drawn by some inexplicable compulsion, began to mirror her movements. They too found themselves unable to stop, their bodies moving in the same wild, repetitive patterns that had claimed Frau Trophia. The dancing spread like a contagion, but a contagion of behavior rather than disease, leaping from person to person with a logic that defied all conventional understanding. Within a week, dozens of people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg. Within a month, the number had grown to perhaps 400 souls, all caught in the grip of what witnesses described as an irresistible urge to move their bodies in ceaseless, exhausting motion. They danced during the day and through the night, pausing only when they collapsed from exhaustion, and resuming their wild movements as soon as they had recovered enough strength to stand. The authorities, faced with a phenomenon beyond their experience or comprehension, responded with the medical wisdom of their time. Physicians were consulted, and many concluded that the dancing was caused by hot blood in the brain, a condition that could only be cured by more dancing. Stages were constructed in the town square. Musicians were hired to provide accompaniment, and the afflicted were encouraged to dance until their fever broke. But the prescription proved disastrously wrong. Rather than curing the dancers, the music and encouragement seemed to attract even more people to join their ranks. The contagion spread with renewed vigor, and the streets of Strasbourg became a surreal theater where hundreds of people moved in an endless, hypnotic ballet of compulsion. You might imagine the scene: the summer heat shimmering off the cobblestones, the rhythmic sound of hundreds of feet moving in unison, the exhausted faces of the dancers as they pursued their relentless motion. Some wore their shoes to tatters, others danced barefoot until their feet were raw and bleeding. Many collapsed from exhaustion, some never to rise again, their bodies finally surrendering to the impossible demands of their compulsion. The dancing plague was not unique to Strasbourg. Similar outbreaks had occurred throughout Europe during the Middle Ages, each following roughly the same pattern. A single person would begin dancing uncontrollably. Others would join them, and the phenomenon would spread through the community like wildfire before eventually burning itself out. The city of Aachen had experienced such an outbreak in 1374, when hundreds of people danced their way through the streets, some claiming to see visions of Christ or the Virgin Mary as they moved. What caused these extraordinary episodes? The answer remains one of history's most intriguing mysteries, a puzzle that has attracted the attention of historians, psychologists, and medical researchers for centuries. The explanations offered by contemporary observers ranged from divine punishment to demonic possession, from corrupted food to planetary alignment. Modern scholars have proposed theories ranging from mass hysteria to ergot poisoning, but none fully explain the complex dynamics of these strange outbreaks. The ergot theory holds particular fascination for those seeking a scientific explanation. Ergot is a fungus that grows on grains, particularly rye, and when consumed in sufficient quantities, it can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and compulsive behavior. In years of poor harvest or unusual weather, ergot contamination of grain supplies could theoretically poison entire communities, leading to collective symptoms that might manifest as uncontrollable dancing. The climate records from 1518 suggest that the conditions were indeed right for ergot contamination. The previous winter had been harsh, followed by a wet spring it would have favored the growth of the fungus on stored grain. The bread that formed the staple of most people's diet might have been contaminated with ergot alkaloids, creating a situation where an entire population was unknowingly consuming a powerful psychoactive substance. Yet the ergot theory, compelling as it may be, cannot fully account for the social dynamics of the dancing plague. The outbreak did not affect people randomly, as food poisoning might be expected to do. Instead, it seemed to follow social networks, spreading most rapidly among those who were already connected by ties of family, friendship, or shared circumstance. The dancing also showed patterns of cultural meaning that suggest something more complex than simple biological poisoning. Many of the dancers, when questioned about their experience, described religious visions or spoke of being compelled to dance by saints or supernatural forces. The dancing often took on the character of a pilgrimage, with participants claiming they were being led to specific holy sites or that they were performing acts of penance. This suggests that the phenomenon may have been as much psychological and spiritual as physical. The psychological explanation focuses on the concept of mass psychogenic illness, a condition where physical symptoms spread through a population by suggestion rather than infection. In communities under severe stress, whether from economic hardship, religious anxiety, or social upheaval, individuals may become extraordinarily susceptible to adopting the symptoms displayed by others. The summer of 1518 was indeed a time of particular stress for the residents of Strasbourg. The city had recently survived a series of crop failures that had brought famine and economic hardship. Political tensions were high, and religious uncertainty was widespread as the Protestant Reformation began to challenge traditional Catholic authority. In such circumstances, the appearance of a single person exhibiting strange behavior might have triggered a cascade of psychological contagion that spread rapidly through the stressed population. The dancing plague may also have represented a form of collective rebellion against the constraints of daily life. In a society where individual expression was strictly controlled by religious and social authority, the compulsive dancing might have offered a socially acceptable outlet for feelings that could not otherwise be expressed. The dancers were not responsible for their actions. They were compelled by forces beyond their control, and this may have provided a kind of psychological liberation that was otherwise unavailable to them. As the weeks passed, the dancing plague began to exhaust itself. The authorities, realizing that their initial strategy of encouragement had backfired, changed their approach. The stages were removed, the musicians were dismissed, and the dancers were instead taken to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers and epileptics. There, they were encouraged to pray for release from their compulsion, rather than to continue their wild movements. Gradually, the dancing subsided. One by one, the afflicted individuals found their compulsion weakening, their movements slowing, their exhausted bodies finally able to rest. The last of the dancers ceased their motion sometime in late August or early September, bringing to an end one of history's most bizarre episodes of collective behavior. How the aristocrats fled and feasted, while the poor died. As our journey through the landscape of plague and pestilence draws toward its conclusion, we turn our attention to perhaps the most troubling aspect of these historical catastrophes: the stark divide between those who could escape death's reach and those who could not. The great mortalities that swept through medieval and early modern Europe revealed, with cruel clarity, the fundamental inequalities that structured society, creating parallel worlds where the wealthy danced at elaborate feasts while the poor died in cramped, airless hovels. You might imagine yourself standing at the edge of two different worlds, separated by nothing more than the accident of birth and the weight of gold in one's purse. On one side, the narrow streets of a plague-stricken city, where the poor huddle in their tenements, unable to flee, unable to afford the medicines that might ease their suffering, unable to do anything but wait and hope that death might pass them by. On the other side, the manicured gardens of a country estate, where the wealthy have retreated to wait out the pestilence in comfort, their tables laden with delicacies, their entertainments elaborate and endless. The capacity to flee was perhaps the greatest privilege that wealth could purchase during times of plague. When the first reports of sickness reached the great houses of London or Paris, Florence or Vienna, the wealthy began their preparations for exodus with the efficiency of military campaigns. Servants were dispatched to ready country estates. Physicians were retained to travel with the household, and vast quantities of food, wine, and luxury goods were loaded onto carriages for the journey to safety. Consider the scene in a wealthy merchant's house in London during the plague of 1665. The master of the house, having received word that the pestilence had appeared in the poorer quarters of the city, immediately sets his household in motion. His wife supervises the packing of her finest clothing, her jewelry, her collection of books and musical instruments. The children are summoned from their studies and told to prepare for an extended stay in the countryside. The servants scurry about, loading wagons with furniture, tapestries, silver plate, and barrels of wine from the cellars. Within days, the entire household has departed, leaving behind only a skeleton crew of servants to maintain the property. The family travels in a convoy of carriages, well provisioned and well protected, making their way along roads that will soon be crowded with other refugees from the plague-stricken city. They carry with them not just their possessions, but their ability to maintain their accustomed way of life, even in exile. The contrast with the experience of the poor could not have been more stark. For the vast majority of urban dwellers, flight was simply not an option. They possessed neither the resources to maintain themselves elsewhere, nor the connections that might provide them with shelter in the countryside. Their livelihoods were tied to specific places: the workshop, the market stall, the dock where they loaded and unloaded ships, and abandoning these meant abandoning their only means of survival. So they stayed, crowded into the tenements and lodging houses that became breeding grounds for disease. The poor quarters of plague cities developed their own terrible ecology, where overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate nutrition created conditions that seemed designed to nurture and spread the pestilence. Entire families might live in a single room, sharing their space with rats and fleas, breathing air thick with the emanations of unwashed bodies and rotting food. But the wealthy, safe in their country retreats, created a different kind of world entirely. The great houses that served as plague refuges became centers of elaborate social life, places where the normal rules of society were suspended in favor of an extended festival of consumption and entertainment. If they could not control the pestilence that ravaged the cities, they could at least assert their dominance over their own immediate environment. The accounts of life in these plague time retreats read like descriptions of another universe. At the Villa Medicia di Poggio e Caino, outside Florence, the Medici family and their guests passed the plague years of the 1630s in a whirlwind of banquets, concerts, and theatrical performances. The villa's gardens were redesigned to accommodate elaborate outdoor entertainments, and the kitchens worked around the clock to provide the delicacies that graced the tables of the exile aristocracy. The menus from these plague time feasts reveal the extent to which the wealthy were insulated from the suffering of the outside world, while the poor in the cities survived on bread and gruel when they could get it at all. The tables of the rich groaned under the weight of roasted peacocks, imported wines, exotic fruits, and elaborate confections shaped like castles and mythical beasts. The contrast was not merely one of quantity, but of entire categories of experience. Music played a particularly important role in these aristocratic plague retreats. The wealthy imported entire orchestras and opera companies to provide entertainment during their exile, transforming their country houses into cultural centers that rivaled the great courts of Europe. The irony was bitter. As the cities fell silent except for the tolling of death bells and the cries of the dying, The countryside echoed with the sounds of elaborate musical performances, the laughter of guests, and the clink of crystal glasses, raised in toast after toast. The servants who made this lifestyle possible occupied a precarious position between the two worlds. They were essential to maintaining the comfort of their employers, yet they were also potential vectors of disease, links between the plague-stricken outside world and the carefully maintained isolation of the great houses. The wealthy approached this problem with the same ruthless efficiency they brought to other aspects of their lives. Servants were quarantined before being allowed to join the household, subjected to medical examinations, and required to swear oaths that they had not been exposed to the pestilence. Those who showed any signs of illness were immediately dismissed, often turned away from the gates without shelter or assistance. The message was clear. The lives of the wealthy were precious and must be protected at all costs, while the lives of their servants were expendable commodities. Yet even the most elaborate precautions could not completely eliminate the risk. The plague occasionally penetrated even the most carefully guarded retreats, and when it did, the response revealed the true nature of the social order. Wealthy victims might receive the attention of the best physicians, the most expensive medicines, and the most comfortable accommodations for their suffering. But their servants, if they fell ill, were typically isolated in the most remote parts of the estate, attended by the minimum number of people necessary to prevent their deaths from becoming too much of an inconvenience. The psychological toll of this disparity was perhaps as devastating as the physical one. The poor, trapped in their plague-stricken cities, were forced to confront not only the immediate threat of disease, but also the knowledge that their suffering was viewed by the wealthy as an acceptable cost of maintaining social order. They could see the empty houses of the rich, the shuttered shops of merchants who had fled, the abandoned workshops of craftsmen who had departed for safer places. Meanwhile, the wealthy, in their rural retreats, developed elaborate justifications for their flight. They spoke of their responsibility to preserve their bloodlines, their duty to maintain the social order, their obligation to protect their wealth for future generations. They cast their exodus not as cowardice, but as prudent stewardship, not as abandonment, but as strategic withdrawal. The literature of the period reflects this divide with painful clarity. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the aftermath of the Black Death, tells the story of 10 young nobles who flee plague-stricken Florence to pass the time in a country villa, entertaining themselves with elaborate storytelling, while the city burns behind them. The framework is presented as admirable. The characters are cultured, witty, and refined, but the underlying message is unmistakable. The wealthy save themselves, while the poor are left to face death alone. The economic consequences of this divide extended far beyond the plague years themselves. The wealthy, having preserved their capital by fleeing to safety, were positioned to take advantage of the economic opportunities that arose in the aftermath of the pestilence. They could buy up the properties of plague victims at reduced prices, hire survivors at depressed wages, and consolidate their control over the resources that had once been more widely distributed. The poor, meanwhile, faced a different kind of mathematics. Those who survived the plague often found themselves in a world where the normal structures of support had collapsed. The guilds that had once provided protection for craftsmen, the parish organizations that had once cared for the needy, the extended family networks that had once offered security, all had been decimated by the disease. The survivors were left to rebuild their lives from nothing, while the wealthy emerged from their retreats to find their relative position strengthened, rather than weakened.